Welcome to the Seeker's Table. I'm your host, Ian Whitemore, and each week I interview a spiritual companion to explore how contemplative practice can guide us into the sacred mutuality that binds us all together. This week is part 4 in a 7-episode series on Lent, where we explore how we can use contemplative practices to open ourselves as we observe the journey through Lent with a particular eye towards justice. My guest is Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown. She is the retired Aisha I. Carden Professor Emerita of Psychology at Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia. She earned her PhD in social psychology from Harvard University, researching nonverbal communication and authoring more than 30 papers on a wide range of topics. Currently, she serves as a spiritual companion, retreat leader, speaker, and author. In addition, she facilitates a monthly Sisters in Silence contemplative prayer and support group designed to be a safe space to share pain and cultivate spiritual depth. Lerita leads specialized retreats and workshops on Howard Thurman, contemplative spirituality, and her book, When the Heart Speaks, Listen, Discovering Inner Wisdom. I hope you will enjoy this conversation with Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown. Lerita, thank you for being with us today on the Seeker's Table.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here.
Now, you grew up Catholic, which
Yes.
is sort of, if we have to have if we put one of the Christian traditions in the contemplative box, I would think the Quakers as well, I suppose. Is this where you were first turned on to contemplative practice, or how did that develop in your life?
Actually, it was not at I attended Catholic school. It's not a Catholic school. I happened to be a child who was attracted to the wind. And so whenever I lived in Southern California, so whenever there was a nice breeze or in some cases a warm wind, I would go outside and just sit in it. And I just loved sitting in the wind. And of course, many of the neighbors and family and friends thought I was a little weird, um, often asking, "What is she doing out there?" And I wasn't doing anything. I was just enjoying the peace and serenity of nature, and particularly of the wind blowing through. And so, at the time, of course, I didn't know that there was anything contemplative about it. But I later found the vocabulary to describe these just natural inclinations on my part. And it was many, many years later that I learned anything about contemplation in the Catholic Church. So my mine was a very natural being drawn outside.
So what was it that got you to pursue these practices, or like how did you start formalizing your practice a little
You know, in many cases, sometimes you have to go outside of your tradition to
more?
be led back into your tradition. So when
Yeah,
I was in college,
often.
yes, my roommate and I were taught how to meditate by a Tibetan Buddhist scholar named Jan Willis.
Mm.
And she happened to still be a graduate student, but she was teaching a class at UC Santa Cruz. And we invited her over to teach us how to meditate. So we had our mala beads, and we were sitting in the lotus position. We had memorized our 100-syllable Sanskrit chant to Dorchi Sampa, the deity that ends all suffering. And so that's how I got started. And then this was during a time when transcendental meditation was very popular, so I tried that out. Started reading a lot of books on spirituality, and it just evolved over time to the point to the point at which I discovered that the contemplative roots of Christianity. But it was a long journey back to Christianity as I tried, Buddhist meditation, mindfulness meditation, Vipassana retreats. I particularly love silent retreats. So, but I am so grateful for for people showing up at the right time and in the right place to lead me to this domain of contemplative spirituality. It's what gives life to my life in so many ways.
And why did you make it back to Christianity, or how did you make it back? Like, why not just stay in a sort of contemplative Buddhist tradition?
I think culturally, I have always been connected to Christianity through both of my parents, my father being four generations African Methodist Episcopal, and my
Hmm.
mother coming out of the Black uh, Baptist tradition. And so once I left high school, I actually started attending predominantly Black churches just
Hmm.
as a way to get that experience. Attending churches as small as 15 or 20 people to a large congregation in Cambridge, Massachusetts when I was in graduate school. So I sort of came back culturally in many ways. That's what sort of drew me back. But it has never closed me off to my desire and sort of at homeness with the mystical traditions of most religious groups. I love reading about Sufism. I love Quaker mysticism. So I I have not allowed my Christian roots to prevent me from experiencing, God or the presence in other ways. I think it's really important to be open to that.
So I think a lot of Christians, they are not that um, familiar with the contemplative paths within Christianity, and some, I think, actually might even be a little bit intimidated. I feel like you say the word meditation sometimes, and they think that's for something else. And so often I say contemplative if I'm talking to a Christian. And how did you, like, where did you sort of develop your contemplative behavior and practices, and how does that now inform your relationship with Jesus and your relationship with the Christian tradition?
It's hard for me to mark the actual time because once I discovered meditation, I was just naturally drawn to it and
Mm-hmm.
practiced. Sometimes more than often. I shouldn't say sometimes more often than at other times when it kind of dropped off. But I would say since the mid '80s, I've been very invested in having some kind of contemplative practice, whether you call it meditation or centering prayer or contemplative prayer or listening prayer. There's all these sort of metaphors for it. But I realized in doing my reading that many of the early Christians led to the desert. They were really our first spiritual directors, companions, and they were out there having contemplative experiences.
Right.
And as I think about Jesus and about the number of times that he got away in the morning and he went away in the evening, I have to ask myself, well, what was he doing?
Mm-hmm.
And my sense is that he was sitting, connecting with the divine presence. So I'm sure that people might be appalled if you were to say Jesus was out there meditating. But
Some
I,
people, yeah.
I suspect he was doing something similar to that. So,
Right.
but and in some ways it makes a lot of sense because as you quiet your mind, as you center down, to use a term from Howard Thurman, uh, you begin to have that sense of unity, of connectedness with everything. But it's really hard to find that or discover it if you are caught up in the swirling of your thoughts all the time. So there. Sometimes I just recommend to people that they just go somewhere and just not think for 10 minutes and see how
Hmm.
they feel
Hmm.
as a just sort of as a baby step towards towards being more committed to sitting down in the divine presence and giving your full attention to that. And I've also discovered because I have sat and met with several people who were Christian as children and decided to try say some form of Buddhism and felt like they weren't connecting. And I'd say, well, you can be Christian and meditate.
Hmm.
So, there's a whole society of Christian meditation. And so we sit down to talk about, so how does that work? Sometimes I recommend scripture to people to read before they sit. But I say, look, why don't you just think about sitting down and having a conversation with God? Uh, because I believe that prayer is a dialogue, not a monologue.
Right.
So you can offer up what you need to say, and then you listen to the voice of God, even though that just may be complete silence. And that's how you connect with God, once or twice or more times during the day.
And here we are at Lent, right? Which is this to talk about the when Jesus would sneak away for a quiet time, right? But here he is. I think we get the 40 days, in my opinion, anyway. Like the 40 days for Lent is for me the 40 days that he went into the wilderness
Yes.
to just have it stripped away so that he could live his mission, to live the life that he'd been called to live. And I often read the passages like when he meets Satan out there. You know, I think you can read it very literally in terms of like there's this apparition that happens and Satan's saying this, or sometimes but I also feel like you can read it metaphorically that when you're in silence, you can see the attachments that you have, the greed that you
Yes.
have, the desire for fame, the desire, the cravings for food or wealth or like however those appear. And um, when we sit in contemplative practice, as we understanding Jesus in this Lenten period, right, we can use the practice to really see how I prefer the adversary rather than Satan. I feel like it can be so loaded, that term, but the adversary is like this voice that just comes, that is, it just leads us into the direction that we don't necessarily want to go.
I might also call it a negative ego self, right?
Yeah.
That little voice, the voice of our inner critic,
Hmm.
who is perhaps maybe uh, trying to challenge us in some kind of way. But
Hmm.
if you think about, uh, what were the two great commandments? To love God with all your heart and all your mind, and then of course to love your neighbor. Uh, I think those were the two big challenges of the 40 days, right? To not
Right.
let the love of power or celebrity or status, any of those things, to interfere, to get in the way of your relationship with God. And similarly, what are you? How are you loving your neighbor, right? So that when you are silent, many of those things bubble up, and they're just right there in front of your face. I mean, I just love the whole 40-day concept. I don't know about you, but when you think about it, 40 days is basically 4 to 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And we see it show up in other kinds of ways. It's the amount of time that you need to heal from surgery, or the amount of time you need to get back from some kind of trauma. So it's a really important time that can, I think, begin a transformation within you.
Now, are you somebody who practices Lent? Because not all Christians do. It sort of exists out there as something that maybe, some churches do and some traditions they don't. Is Lent something that you use as a practice?
I do. I think the time in Catholic school, there are certain kinds of habits that get embedded in you.
Yeah.
Um, in addition to marrying a man who's a devout Catholic, so
Hmm.
so I'm kind of surrounded by Lent, but I use it as a time to abstain from something that I know I probably need to. Maybe a habit that I've gotten into, or a food that I know is probably not healthy for me. Um, as a way, in some ways, to strengthen my discipline overall, but particularly for my practice. Because, as I say, I'm very high on contemplative prayer. But there are times when that evening practice kind of slides by the wayside.
I don't know what you're
So,
talking about.
and so I use that 40 days to work on the discipline,
Hmm.
so that I can actually apply that to some of the spiritual disciplines that I need to strengthen. But I also try to add something that I need to add. It might be more exercise, or it might be to uh, not to cut out some social media or some television. Some of the
Hmm.
things that create atmospheres that are not aiding my peace and joy. I'm a very big on peace and joy person, and so uh, I have always used that time to find some things that I need to stop doing, and to do some things I have not been doing,
Hmm.
as a way, as I said, to gird my discipline, particularly my spiritual disciplines.
Well, I think that's an interesting point because very often we think about Lent as like, what am I going to cut out? Right.
Mhm.
But in some respects, what you're talking about is like, how do I also gain wisdom? How do I make room for gaining wisdom? And I don't know if, when you're working with your directees or your companions, like how do you sort of shape that conversation around, gaining wisdom, using times like this to gain wisdom as well, and what that looks
Right. In many cases, I will, talk with them about what it is that they need to be doing for
like? Hmm.
themselves, because I think that wisdom emerges out of practice. It emerges out of everyday living, and in many cases, it emerges out of trauma. Something has happened, and what is it that you're learning from this about yourself? And how can it make you grow, and how can it make you more expansive and more inclusive? So it's amazing how you don't often think of yourself as wise until you begin to reflect back on the things that you learned along the way. Some of them from happy things that may have occurred,
Right.
and some from really difficult, challenging things that occurred. And in that, you come away with some just, gem of wisdom. So, for example, I, and this was something that I talked about this past year, that if there was ever a time to invest time and energy into your spiritual life, it would be during a pandemic, because the best thing to have during a crisis is a vibrant, active spiritual life. So, what are you doing each day that is either feeding, or in some way nurturing your spirit and your spiritual life? Are you reading inspirational material? Are you pausing to just acknowledge the presence? Are you calling anybody to encourage them? There's just so many things that you can do as part of a regular spiritual practice, and and I think why it's important to have one is because it anchors you in a storm.
Mm.
And we've been through several storms in the last year.
Too
And
much.
and
Last 4
and
years.
right. And so I think that, when I have a person who's just come off the street and got hit by a rubber bullet, or I have a person who's screaming at the television,
Yeah.
I say, okay, we need to come in a bit, and we need to protect our inner sanctuaries.
Mhm.
One of my favorite lines from Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited is that he felt that Jesus was really focused on the inward center of people, of his people. It's like, what is your inner life like? And are you in control of that? Because if in fact
Mm.
someone can come along and hurl an insult at you and it throws you off your equilibrium, then they will always be in control of you. And
Right.
so if you're screaming at the television, then it means that somebody else has has control over your inner life. There's so much beauty in the wisdom of that, right?
There's so many people listening to this right now being like, oh my God, someone's in control of my outer life.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's true. It's true.
Yeah.
Which is why one of the things that we chose to do in this past year, my husband and I, what first we had a silent retreat at home because we just could not go out and be among people, and so we
Right.
took 3 days. We took 3 days of shutting off everything.
Mhm.
No television, no telephone, no computers, and we basically were in silence. And we would have a reading once a day, and it was fabulous. It was just so fabulous to be able to create that kind of atmosphere at home. But also, I think it's important for us to be cognizant of, basically, what are we doing and who are we allowing to determine our peace and joy? Who's stolen your joy is a good question that I think every
Mm.
person should ask, if in fact they're not feeling joyful.
Mhm. I'm realizing I sort of made a little bit of a joke of like, what we've been going through the last 4 years. But really, what we've been going through the last 4 years have been with us since the founding of this nation, right? And it's just become
Yeah.
so incredibly evident. And I think, when I think about this Lenten journey and all that we've actually been shown, particularly with this last year, about who we are as citizens of this nation, like people who are claimed by this identity that is called American, in the United States. And we talk about Lent, like what is there for us to release so that something can be reborn and renewed. Um, well, I just curious if you have anything that you would like to share just out of your own experience about what you've seen and what you think the practice has to say, or what contemplative work can do for us, seeing what we've some of us have always known what's here, and I
Yes.
think some people have had to really wrestle um, with a new awareness.
Yes. I think it's shock. I think it's been shocking for some people, and the pandemic itself has had us to pause so that we could see things we normally wouldn't see because we were too busy. But it has brought certainly racial inequalities and some of our the ways in which we've treated many groups of people in the United States over time to the forefront. And I think that contemplative practices uh, give us an opportunity to begin the sort of redemptive process.
Mm.
And that is that that as you continue to listen for the voice of God, that you will begin to see things, things will begin to show up in your life to perhaps show you what is your role in all of this. What
Mm.
are you being called to do about this? Because I personally believe that every single breathing person is called in some way to restore God's beloved creation.
Mm.
And everybody has a part. And so the question becomes, are you listening for your part? And as with most social transformations, not everybody is supposed to do the same thing. Not everybody is supposed to be out in the street. In the civil rights movement, not everybody was in the street. You had to
Right.
have people there to take care of children. Somebody had to cook. Somebody had to put up people. There were all kinds. There were lawyers who were working behind the scenes. I mean, there were any number of roles that people played. But I think that everybody is called. And one of the beautiful things about linking contemplation and social justice or mysticism and social change, particularly in the work of Howard Thurman, was that he was clearly concerned about changing laws and but more importantly changing hearts,
Mhm.
because he felt that this this idea of treating a certain segment of the population inhumanely uh, was detrimental to everybody, not just those that were being treated inhumanely, and that he believed that we were all being called towards a oneness or a unity, and
Mhm.
that what was most important was for us to begin to find ways in which we are connected and united, um, and to quit emphasizing ways in which we are divided or separate. And he was particularly hard on denominational scrimmages, like my denomination is better than your denomination,
Yeah.
or or my religious tradition is better than, or those people who practice this are going to hell. I mean, all of that. He was like, this is in total opposition to life, with the capital L, and to oneness. And so he felt anything moving us closer to oneness was important. And I would add to that that when we start practicing pausing and quieting down, we can begin to hear the voice of the Holy Spirit calling us and guiding us as to what our role should be. And it leads us into what I like to describe as sacred activism.
Mhm.
Sacred activism being when we are involved in political or social activism, but we invite the Spirit in to guide us. So one
Mhm.
of the, sort of, to me, particularly as a spiritual director, one of the most important things that we can do is to begin to not only listen to and we get these little messages all the time. I mean, it's kind of like, some people call it intuition. I tell people just rename GPS God positioning system, right? We all have one,
Mhm. Right.
and that if we would listen to it,
If we listen.
if we listen, right? And I think at the same time, we have to surrender and yield some, right? So we have to engage more in discernment, not making every decision ourselves, but to say, okay, I'm not quite sure what to do with this. So I'm going to go sit down and I'm going to offer this to the Spirit and let the Spirit provide me with an answer. And the answer may not come in the silence at that moment. But what I think silence does, particularly, is that it creates this little space for for spirit to get through. And it might be later in the afternoon when you're chopping celery in the kitchen, but
Right.
you've created that space by just centering down for a little bit. You've created that space for that guidance to come through. And so, with the guidance of the Spirit, then our activism becomes sacred.
I think even, sometimes it even might even take years, like, of just coming back again and again. And what I like, what I appreciate about what you just said is, I think when we try to think our way out of something, um, we've read a lot of books about, let's just take race, right? We've read a lot of books about race. And every year we read more books about race, racism, white supremacy. And yet here we still are. And I think all of that stuff is important, like the education piece, but ultimately for me, when I think about how we are going to do the redemptive work of, like, how do we rid ourselves of white supremacy? How do we rid ourselves of this whiteness, right? That is just this smothering thing. There is this, for me, an invitation to God, because I can't rid myself of it necessarily. I can do what I can in terms of the intellect. And yet there's this grace that I think is really necessary if we want to enter into a renewal in this nation of, take this from us.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly involves a lot of self-reflection if people are willing to engage in the emotions that arise from that.
Right,
And what I've learned is that, uh, particularly as a former psychology professor,
right.
is that we we arrive as babies not knowing a thing about race or ethnicity or gender for that matter,
Right.
but we immediately start to get information communicated to us about who we are and where we stand in the world, and so it becomes a part of our self concept. And part of the I was just writing about this last night. Part of the difficulty with dismantling white supremacy is that when many white people encounter someone who violates the stereotypes, it is threatening. You know, if in fact you encounter someone who's African American, who's brilliant and competent, and knows their own inner power, it's scary
A
because
professor from educated at Harvard, for example.
right. We won't even talk about all the. I used to call it white surprise. Right?
Yeah,
People come to my office and open the door, and they're like,
right.
But I think what's important though is that you begin to see that because you can engage in denial or projection all you want for most of your life, but begin to really dissect that and say, "Wow, look at what I'm feeling right now. This is what I need to offer up to God. This
Hmm.
feeling of uncomfortableness, this feeling of threat, this feeling of because they're not connected to any kind of self that God would have created for you. And so I think of it as like peeling off the layers, of anything, right? And so many people have written about this. Carl Jung, says we spend the first 35 years constructing our ego, we spend the next 35 deconstructing it. Richard Rohr has, all kinds of people have written
Sure.
about false self, true self. But we have been given a constructed self, and it is important, regardless of who you are, to begin to pull out of that what is authentic to you and what was it that somebody just kind of laid on you, and
Right.
that you've just been living from. And I think at the bottom of all of that really is a spiritual self. Thurman kind of, talks about being told that he was the holy child of God by his grandmother over and over again, and that it helped him a lot to have that as part of his self concept. Uh, William James wrote about it way back in the day that he thought that there was a spiritual component to ourselves. And so, in finding that and in nurturing that, I have found that in many cases, when I encounter someone who I uh, know is has not done their work on their whiteness, that's how I describe it.
Right.
I understand that's what's going on. It's not about me. And
Mhm.
I can continue to do whatever it is that I need to do, despite the fact that I have encountered someone who obviously is having difficulty because I violated their norms around white supremacy. So some of it is individual work. Some of it can be enhanced, I think, in churches, in groups, in meditations, in discussions, and then in those moments when you are in the middle of it. You're in an interaction, or you're in the airport, or you're in, and somebody sits down next to you. Do you just close your book and look the other way, or do you have a conversation with another human spirit, as Thurman would call it? So,
Mhm.
we have opportunities if we want to work on this, but we also have to engage in that work and not let it just be an intellectual activity. We have to deal with the emotions that come up, and then we have to deal with the actions that uncomfortableness that won't allow you to actually start that conversation on the airplane. I remember doing a retreat recently, and I said, I want you to go sit down and talk to somebody you've never seen in your life. And I said, yes, it's going to make you feel uncomfortable. Sit with the uncomfortableness and do it anyway.
Mhm.
And I think that's how we begin to sort of make that movement, along with continuing our contemplative practice of sitting in silence, if that be one of them, reading inspirational material, going outside, um, and doing something that that feeds your spirit, whether that's gardening or walking or helping some other person that needs some help, whatever that is, that makes you, as Thurman would say, makes you come alive, right? Those kinds of things are really important to creating a new self that then allows you to begin to let go of those things that were given to you, as a matter of your growing up in American society.
And just the example, and I realize we're kind of at time, but I just, the example that you just gave of going to meet somebody else, it also made me think of, like, at this time, as we're going through Lent, as we're sitting with this, the people who are sort of watching these videos and doing stuff like that, they're going to be doing a Lectio Divina thing with me.
Hmm.
And the person that they may not know actually may be themselves,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Because they haven't actually sat down and met themselves. And, regardless of what racial group we get plotted into, there's something for us here to explore about, who am I called to, and this contemplative practice gives us the opportunity to see where we need to go.
Yes, and I believe that a lot of people avoid
Mhm.
finding out who they are because oftentimes there's some pain there,
Mhm.
and they don't think that they can get through that pain to the other side. We do a lot of stuff to anesthetize pain all the time, right? Whether
Mhm.
it's shopping or drinking or whatever. But I would say that with God, you can get through the pain, which is why you need to have a contemplative practice so that you can continuing that rootedness and that anchor in God,
Mhm.
right? And not think that you can do that on your own. But and to pray, please help me move through this pain, that I know I'm encountering as I look upon myself, and all the things that got packed in there over in the course of their lives. Um, and I think oftentimes many of the people who really are stuck, in that kind of hostile white supremacy, are
Mhm.
ones who have associated pain. I call it that, from something else that may have happened to them, and so it doesn't. The trauma doesn't get healed, and so they stay in that state. So I think it's really important for people to to begin to take seriously um, the cultivation of a spiritual life. It reminds me of my favorite passage, in the Bible about Nicodemus, going to Jesus at night
Right.
and saying, what are you talking about? Born of the Spirit, right?
Right.
And I think basically Jesus is saying, look, you can engage in all these things in the world, but what's really important is the spirit part of you. And what are you doing about that? No, you don't have to go back to the womb. You need to look at that. And so I just want to encourage people to pay attention to whether or not they are nurturing and in some way uh, cultivating a spiritual life, because I think that's the way through and perhaps the way out of wherever it is that we've been and wherever it is that we inevitably are going to have to go sooner or later.
Lerita, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for
I really
inviting me.
appreciate
It's
it.
been a joy. Yes.
I hope you found this conversation with Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown encouraging and helpful for your journey. You can find out more about her work by visiting her websites, peaceforhearts.com and leritacolemanbrown.com. And I'll put links to her websites and to her book in the show notes. Thank you for joining us at the Seeker's Table. You can find all of our interviews on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as in the free Spiritual Resources Library on the Seeker's Table website. I categorize all of the interviews based on theme and keyword, so if you're looking for guidance in a particular area, you can search for that resource and you'll find ones that are related to each other. My name is Ian White Marr, and I hope you'll join me again next week.